The woman was already dying when the overseer leaned down toward her, his boots sinking into the wet earth. Her breath rattled like loose stones in a jar, each inhale thinner than the last. Yet her eyes remained open, fixed on the gray sky above. Snow threatened from the clouds, the kind that came quietly and stayed too long. The overseer spat without hesitation, the act sharp and casual, as if ending a sentence. Laughter followed, thin and cruel, carried by the wind across the silent field. No one spoke. No one dared move. Even the crows on the fence went still. The moment unfolded in plain sight, beneath a sky that seemed to withhold judgment, as if even the heavens refused to witness what was about to happen. The enslaved woman lay on the ground near the edge of the fields, her body weakened beyond resistance, her breathing shallow and uneven. Days of illness and neglect had reduced her to stillness, yet her presence unsettled the space around her. Workers stood nearby, frozen in quiet dread, knowing that looking too closely could invite punishment. The overseer approached her not with concern or urgency, but with visible irritation, as though her suffering were an inconvenience interrupting his authority. He paused only long enough to look down at her, his expression hardened by years of cruelty mistaken for discipline. To him, she was not a person nearing death, but a symbol of defiance for surviving as long as she had. The air was cold, sharp enough to sting the skin, and the earth beneath her was damp from the previous night's frost. When he spat, the action was deliberate, meant to degrade rather than harm, a final insult delivered with ease. The sound of it striking the ground was soft, yet it echoed louder than any shout, cutting through the silence like a blade. No one reacted. The enslaved people had learned that reacting was dangerous, that even sympathy could be read as rebellion. Some lowered their heads, others fixed their eyes on the distance, pretending not to see what could never be unseen. The overseer straightened, satisfied, as though he had restored order through humiliation. He muttered something dismissive about weakness and waste, his words meant to remind everyone watching of their place. The woman did not cry out. Her face remained calm in a way that felt unnatural, as if fear had already left her body. Her eyes followed him as he turned away, and in them was neither hatred nor pleading, but something quieter and heavier. A faint movement passed across her lips, almost lost to the wind, suggesting words that were never meant for him alone. The ground near her fingers pressed inward slightly, disturbed by her final effort to remain connected to the world above it. The overseer did not notice this, nor did he notice how the air seemed to thicken after his act, how the stillness deepened instead of breaking. As he walked back toward the main house, boots crunching softly against the frost, the power he believed he held felt unquestionable to him, reinforced by years of unchallenged cruelty and silence. Behind him, the woman remained where she was, breathing slowing, eyes still open, carrying the weight of what had been done not only to her, but to all who had been forced to witness it, while the plantation itself seemed to absorb the moment, as if remembering it for Laterras. The overseer turned away, and the field slowly exhaled. The woman's lips moved again, this time with purpose. Her breath was shallow, each rise of her chest delayed, as though the body itself hesitated to continue. Yet her eyes sharpened, fixing on something beyond the men standing there. A sound escaped her mouth, not loud enough to be called a voice, not clear enough to be understood by most. It slipped into the air like a secret meant only for those willing or fated to hear it. The wind carried it low, brushing against ankles and dry grass, thinning as it traveled. Only one person noticed. A child, too young to be hardened by routine cruelty, stood at the far edge of the workers, half hidden behind an older figure. He had been sent to carry water earlier and had not yet been dismissed. Unlike the others, he was still learning where not to look. When the woman spoke, his head lifted instinctively, ears straining, heart tightening for reasons he could not explain. The words did not sound like pleading or prayer. They came out steady, deliberate, as if rehearsed long before that moment. He leaned forward without realizing it, drawn closer by something colder than curiosity. The syllables reached him broken but unmistakable, shaped by pain yet sharpened by certainty. He did not understand them fully, but he felt their weight settle inside his chest. They were not meant to comfort, nor to warn the living of her death. They felt like a promise, spoken softly so it would not be interrupted. The child's hands clenched at his sides, and a chill crept up his arms that had nothing to do with the weather. Around him, the others remained unmoving, their silence thick with fear and habit. They heard nothing, or perhaps chose not to. The woman's voice seemed to pass through them, avoiding those who had learned to survive by deafness. Her eyes flicked once toward the child, a brief acknowledgement that lasted no longer than a heartbeat, yet it bound him to the moment more tightly than chains. Then her mouth closed, the effort costing her more than it should have, and her breathing faltered. The child stepped back, pulse racing, suddenly aware that he had crossed an invisible line. He knew, without knowing how, that repeating what he had heard would change something, that the words were not meant to be shared lightly. As the overseer's footsteps faded and the field returned to its uneasy quiet, the whisper lingered, not in the air but in the child himself, settling deep where fear and memory take root. Waiting for the night to come, the overseer dismissed the moment with a laugh that rang too loudly for the quiet field, a sound meant to crush whatever unease might have taken shape behind him. He had heard whispers before, last breaths shaped into nonsense, mutterings born of fever or fear, and he had learned long ago to treat them as nothing more than proof of weakness. To him, talk of curses belonged to the same category as ghost stories told to frighten children into obedience. He turned back briefly, smirking, his confidence fueled by years of unchecked power and the belief that nothing spoken by a dying slave could ever reach him. He waved a hand dismissively, as though brushing away smoke. His words came easily, sharp with mockery, declaring that superstition thrived only among those who needed excuses for their suffering. The ground beneath his boots felt solid, familiar, reassuring. He had overseen punishments, deaths, and burials without consequence, and each unchallenged act had reinforced his certainty that he stood beyond judgment. If curses were real, he believed, someone like him would have felt them long ago. Instead, he stood warm, fed, and untouched, while others faded into the soil without leaving marks on the world. The workers did not respond. They had learned that silence was safer than agreement or defiance. Some had heard stories passed down in murmurs after dark, tales of wronged spirits and reckoning, but none dared speak of them now. The overseer mistook their quiet for submission, for acceptance of his words. He did not notice how the air felt heavier after his laughter, how the stillness lingered rather than breaking. His confidence drowned out subtler signs, the way arrogance often does. He turned fully away then, already moving on in his mind, thinking of schedules, rations, and the coming holiday. Christmas approached, a time he associated with warmth and reward, with proof that his life was ordered and favored. The idea that a dying woman's whisper could follow him beyond the field felt absurd. He prided himself on being practical, on rejecting fear as a weakness he could not afford. In his certainty, he failed to recognize the danger of dismissing what he could not control. Behind him, unseen, the woman's body lay still, her silence deeper than before. The laugh that had sealed his dismissal echoed faintly in the cold air, not fading as quickly as it should have. Though he believed the moment ended the instant he turned away, something had shifted, subtle and irreversible. By laughing at the idea of consequence, by reducing the whisper to superstition, he had closed his ears to warning and opened himself fully to what waits patiently for those who refuse to listen. That night arrived with an unease that crept in before darkness fully settled, slipping between fences and across frozen ground, as if the land itself were uneasy. The first sign came from the horses, usually eager to be led into the warmth of the barns once the sun dropped low. They halted at the doors, hooves stamping nervously, eyes wide and rolling white. No amount of pulling or soothing words could convince them to step inside. Their breath steamed heavily, but they backed away again and again, snorting in alarm as though something unseen blocked their path. The cows followed soon after, lowing softly at first, then louder, restless in a way the workers had never witnessed. When driven toward shelter, they turned sharply aside, pressing together in the open yard despite the cold biting at their flanks. Chickens refused their coops, fluttering wildly when anyone tried to herd them, scattering feathers across the dirt. Even the dogs that usually slept near the barns tucked their tails and stayed close to the quarters, whining and pacing as if listening for sounds no human ear could catch. The workers exchanged glances in silence. Animals were sensitive. Everyone knew that, aware of storms before clouds gathered and danger before it revealed itself. Some whispered that beasts could sense death, that they knew when something had gone wrong in the balance of things. No one spoke loudly enough for the overseer to hear. Fear had a way of tightening throats, and no one wanted to explain what they themselves did not understand. Lantern light flickered across the barn walls, revealing nothing unusual, no broken beams or intruders, yet the animal's terror persisted. One horse reared suddenly, nearly knocking a handler into the mud, and the man stumbled back, heart racing. He swore under his breath, not in anger, but in confusion. The air near the barn doors felt colder than the rest of the yard, heavy in a way that made breathing feel deliberate. Frost formed along the wooden frames faster than it should have, creeping inward despite the lamp's weak warmth. By the time the overseer was informed, frustration outweighed concern. He accused the workers of mishandling the animals, of inventing problems to avoid duties. Yet even he paused when he saw the scene. Dozens of creatures clustered together under the open sky, refusing the safety they had known all their lives. For a brief moment, doubt flickered across his face before he masked it with anger. He ordered the animals left where they were, declaring the nonsense finished. As the night deepened, the plantation lay unsettled, barns standing empty and dark, while the animals remained outside, alert and trembling, staring toward the fields where the woman had fallen, as if waiting for something to move again. By the next morning, the overseer became aware of something clinging to him that had no name at first, only a presence that unsettled him in quiet moments. It announced itself faintly as he washed his hands at the basin, a sour, earthen odor rising through the steam. He paused, lifting his fingers to his nose, frowning. The smell reminded him of turned soil after rain, mixed with something older, something left too long beneath the surface. He scrubbed harder, nails scraping skin, convinced it would fade as easily as it had appeared. It did not. The scent followed him through the house, faint but persistent, surfacing when he least expected it. While eating, he caught it again and lost his appetite. While signing papers, it drifted up, making his jaw tighten. Soap, lye, and even whiskey did nothing to mask it. He washed until his hands reddened and stung, but the smell seemed to come from deeper than the skin, as though it belonged to him now. Each time he noticed it, irritation flared first, then a flicker of unease he refused to name. Others noticed as well. A servant flinched slightly when handed a cup. A clerk opened a window without explanation. No one spoke of it directly, but glances lingered, curious and cautious. The overseer responded with sharp words, accusing them of insolence, yet his confidence wavered. He kept his hands clenched at his sides, suddenly aware of their weight, of how often he used them to command, to punish, to remind others of his power. As the day wore on, the smell grew stronger, thickening in warm rooms, pressing against his senses. It reminded him of the burial pits he had overseen, of bodies lowered too quickly and covered too shallowly. The memory irritated him, not with guilt, but with the annoyance of being reminded. He tried to laugh it off, telling himself it was imagination, a trick of the mind after a restless night. Still, he avoided touching his face, avoided bringing his hands too close. By evening, the scent seemed to pulse, appearing and retreating like breath. He dreamed of earth piling up around his wrists, woke with his fists clenched, palms damp. He washed again, longer this time, watching the water cloud as if stained. The smell lingered even then, stubborn and patient. It did not feel like decay alone, but like something claiming him, marking him quietly. He told himself it would pass, that all things did. Yet as he dried his hands and caught the odor once more, stronger than before, a cold certainty settled in him, unwelcome and heavy, that this was not something he could scrub away, not something meant to fade quickly, but a reminder carried with him, following each movement, waiting for the moment when it would no longer need to remain subtle. The woman was buried before dawn, carried out with efficiency rather than care, as though the act itself were an inconvenience to be finished quickly. There was no gathering, no spoken name, no pause long enough to acknowledge that a life had ended. Two men lowered her into the shallow pit at the edge of the field where others had been placed before, the earth already loose as if it had been waiting. The cold had stiffened her body, and the fabric wrapped around her was thin, offering no dignity, only concealment. The overseer did not attend. He had declared the matter closed the night before, and in his mind, that was enough. No prayer marked the moment. No words rose to the sky to ask for mercy or rest. The soil fell in heavy clumps, dull against the wrapped form, the sound final and unremarkable. Those tasked with the burial worked quickly, eyes down, hands numb, eager to leave the place before daylight made it too visible. When the last mound was shaped, it looked no different from the others, a low rise of dark earth against the pale frost. The men stepped back, tools over their shoulders, believing the task finished. It was not long before the ground changed. By mid-morning, someone noticed the mound looked uneven, as though the soil had shifted inward. At first it was dismissed as settling, a common enough occurrence. But as the hours passed, the earth continued to sink, slowly but noticeably, creating a shallow depression where the body lay. Frost clung to the edges, highlighting the change. No footprints marked the area, no signs of disturbance that could explain it. The ground simply seemed to be drawing itself down. Whispers followed, cautious and brief. Some said the soil was too soft, others blamed melting frost, yet none of the explanations felt complete. The workers avoided the spot when possible, taking longer routes through the field. One man crossed himself quickly when he passed, though he could not have explained why. The air above the grave felt colder, heavier, and birds refused to land nearby, veering away at the last moment, as if repelled. By evening, the depression had deepened further, enough that it could no longer be ignored. The overseer was informed, irritation flashing across his face. He ordered more dirt piled on, demanding the ground be leveled properly this time. The men obeyed, shoveling earth into the hollow until it matched the surrounding field. They tamped it down firmly, leaving it smooth and neat before retreating. When they returned the next morning, the earth had sunk again, deeper than before, as if something beneath it were pulling insistently downward. No rain had fallen. No animal tracks marked the surface. The plantation stood quiet around it, barns and houses unchanged, yet the grave refused to stay closed, the land itself seeming unwilling to hold what had been placed there, as though the absence of prayer and name had left something unresolved, something that would not allow the ground to rest after the burial. Sleep became something the child approached with dread rather than relief. Night no longer arrived gently, but seemed to press down all at once, heavy and watchful. When he lay on his thin mattress, eyes fixed on the dark beams above, he felt as though the air itself was listening. The whisper he had heard in the field did not repeat itself in words, yet it lingered in sensation, a tightening in the chest that grew stronger once the lamps were blown out. He told himself it was imagination, that fear fed on silence, but his body refused to believe the lie. The first night, he woke suddenly with no memory of a dream, only the certainty that something had stirred him. The room was still, the other sleepers breathing softly, yet a sound reached him from outside, faint but steady. It was the sound of footsteps moving slowly across frozen ground. Not hurried, not heavy, but deliberate, each step placed with care. He held his breath, listening, waiting for them to fade. They did not. Instead, they circled, passing by the window and then returning again, tracing a path that felt intentional. The second night, the footsteps came closer. He sat up, heart pounding, eyes straining toward the darkened doorway. Moonlight spilled weakly across the floor, revealing nothing, yet the sound was clearer now, the soft crunch of frost under bare feet. He pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders, afraid to wake anyone, afraid even more of being told it was nothing. When the steps stopped just outside, the silence that followed felt louder than the sound itself. He did not sleep again until morning light crept in. By the third night, exhaustion had dulled his fear but sharpened his awareness. The footsteps returned at the same hour, steady and unchanging, as if following a schedule only the ground understood. He noticed then that they never crossed the threshold. They paced, paused, and turned back, respecting a boundary he could not see. Each time, his thoughts went to the field, to the place where the ground would not stay still. He wondered if the earth itself was walking, searching. He began to wake before the sound came, moments before, as though summoned. His heart would race without cause, his eyes snapping open to darkness, and then the steps would begin, right on time. He stopped trying to convince himself it was coincidence. Something had noticed him, something tied to the whisper he carried. As dawn broke and the world returned to normal, the child felt no comfort, knowing night would come again, and with it the footsteps, patient and persistent, waiting for him to understand why they followed him and no one else. Sleep came to him reluctantly that night, thin and broken, slipping in around the edges of his thoughts rather than claiming him fully. When the dream took hold, it did so with unsettling clarity. He found himself standing on the plantation grounds on Christmas morning, the house behind him dressed in decorations that looked correct at first glance, wreaths stiff on the doors, ribbons frozen mid-fall. The sky was bright but colorless, as if all warmth had been drained from it. The air carried the sharp bite of winter, colder than any Christmas he could remember, pressing against his skin until each breath felt scraped raw. Frost covered everything, but it was not the white frost he knew. It clung to the ground, the fences, and the trees in a dark, oily sheen, glistening like black glass. Where it touched wood, it spread in branching patterns that looked too deliberate, crawling instead of forming. His boots cracked against it as he walked, the sound echoing unnaturally loud. With every step, the frost crept higher, coating his legs, numbing them until movement felt slow and heavy. He tried to call out, to summon someone from the house, but his voice failed him. The silence pressed in, complete and suffocating. When he looked down, he saw that his hands were rimed with the same black frost, the skin beneath pale and rigid. No matter how hard he rubbed them together, the cold only deepened, seeping inward as if it were not cold at all, but something solid settling into his bones. The smell of earth filled his nose, rich and damp, completely out of place in the frozen scene. Ahead of him, the fields stretched wide and empty, yet he felt watched. Shapes moved at the edges of his vision, just beyond clarity, leaving faint impressions in the frost that did not fade. He followed them without choosing to, drawn forward by a weight in his chest that grew heavier with each step. The closer he came to the center of the field, the darker the frost became, pooling thickly around a low depression in the ground. He knew, without being told, that this was where Christmas should have brought warmth, song, and comfort. Instead, the frost pulsed faintly, as though breathing. From it rose a cold, so intense it stole the strength from his legs. He tried to step back, but the ground held him fast. The black frost crept upward, locking his joints, sealing his mouth before he could scream. Just before it reached his eyes, he saw Christmas morning not as celebration but as judgment, stripped of light and mercy. And when he woke, gasping in the dark, the echo of that frozen silence clung to him, leaving him certain that the holiday he had always awaited would not arrive as he expected. The mirror hung in the overseer's room like a quiet witness, tall and narrow, its surface slightly warped from age. He had passed it countless times without thought, using it only to straighten his coat or adjust his collar before facing the day. That evening, unsettled by restless hours and the lingering smell he could not escape, he stopped before it longer than usual. The lamplight flickered, stretching his reflection thinner, making his eyes appear darker than they should have been. He frowned, leaning closer, convinced the glass was playing tricks on him. As he lifted his hand to smooth his hair, a sharp sound split the stillness. A thin crack appeared at the center of the mirror, no impact to explain it, no warning. It crept outward like a living thing, branching slowly, deliberately. He froze, breath caught, staring as the fracture widened. The room felt suddenly colder, the lamplight dimmer, as though the glass had stolen something from the air. His reflection distorted around the crack, his face bending into unfamiliar shapes. Then he noticed the movement behind him. In the mirror's depth, just beyond his shoulder, stood the faint outline of a woman. She was not reflected by the room itself, no shadow falling where she should have been, yet there she was in the glass, clearer with each heartbeat. Her form was still, her head slightly tilted, eyes fixed on him with a calm that tightened his chest. He did not hear footsteps, did not feel breath at his back, yet the certainty of her presence pressed against him. He spun around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. The walls stood bare, the door closed, the air unmoving. When he turned back to the mirror, she remained, closer now, her face no longer blurred by the crack. Recognition struck him then, unwelcome and sharp. It was the woman from the field, her expression unchanged, neither accusing nor pleading. The crack split further, running straight through her reflected face without disturbing it, as though she existed beyond the glass's damage. Panic surged. He raised his hand again, this time to touch the mirror, to prove it solid, real. Before his fingers made contact, the glass fractured completely, lines racing outward until the surface shattered with a dull, final sound. Shards fell inward, scattering across the floor like broken ice. The reflection vanished instantly, leaving only empty space and the overseer's ragged breathing. He stood there trembling, staring at the ruined frame, unable to shake the certainty that what he had seen was not an illusion born of guilt or fatigue. The mirror had not shown him something new, but something he had refused to face, and as the last shard settled, a deeper fear took hold, the fear that the barrier between what was buried and what walked freely had begun to crack. Just as easily, just as silently, the bell rang before anyone could see who had pulled the rope, a sound sharp and sudden in the frozen dawn. Its toll did not follow the pattern of daily routine. It lacked the authority and rhythm of the overseer's usual summons. Instead, it was irregular, dragging on longer than it should, vibrating through the air and making the skin tingle as though the sound itself had weight. No wind had moved the rope. No hand had been seen in the shadows. Yet the bell clanged again, echoing across the plantation and through the empty fields where frost had not yet melted. The sound startled the workers who were beginning their day, their breath clouding in the cold, and they froze, unsure whether to move or remain still, their ears straining for any hint of explanation. The overseer appeared first at the top of the steps, face pale under the pale light of dawn. He had been certain the plantation would rise in predictable silence, yet the bell defied expectation. He stepped down quickly, boots crunching against the frost-hardened dirt, hands reaching for the rope to stop the clanging. But as soon as he touched it, the rope snapped taut, vibrating violently in his grip, and the bell's tone deepened. It was a sound he could not command, could not dismiss, and it carried an unnatural resonance, low and hollow, that seemed to draw all attention toward the fields beyond the quarters. The echo carried further than the ears could normally perceive, a mournful, metallic cry that wrapped around the workers' hearts and made them shiver without wind. No one had moved the bell, and the child who had once heard the dying woman's whisper felt a familiar tightening in the chest, a cold pulse that told him the sound was not ordinary. He clutched his coat closer, stepping back into shadow, aware without words that this ringing was something alive, a warning or a summoning he did not fully understand. Others glanced at one another, faces pale and unsteady. Some swore it was the wind, others that the bell had become unmoored, but the fear in their eyes betrayed their uncertainty. The overseer, for all his years of control, found himself uncertain as well. The tolling continued, irregular but constant, shaking the air and carrying with it a weight of inevitability. It was not merely a sound. It was a presence, stretching outward, touching the corners of the plantation and lingering in the shadows of barns and quarters alike. Windows rattled slightly in their frames, shutters shook, and even the dogs that had remained loyal to their posts whimpered softly. As the minutes stretched, the overseer's confidence waned, replaced with an unnameable dread. Each clang felt directed at him personally, each vibration a reminder that some acts, some cruelties, could not be ignored, and that the plantation itself might be remembering, speaking, and waiting for what was to come. The workers began noticing it first in small, almost imperceptible ways, a movement that did not belong to any living thing yet mimicked the overseer perfectly. Shadows that should have fallen behind him stretched forward, lagged, or split into shapes that followed a different rhythm than his steps. Sometimes they would linger, frozen in place while he moved on, or twist along walls and corners in ways the light should not have allowed. At first, the men and women whispered among themselves, attributing the phenomena to poor eyesight, to fatigue, or to tricks of the low winter sun filtering through the bare branches. Yet the occurrences grew too consistent to ignore. The overseer, oblivious at first, continued his rounds with habitual authority, issuing orders that were met with reluctant obedience. He noticed little, But those who worked closest to him began to hesitate, feeling their eyes drawn to the strange patterns of light and shadow that seemed almost sentient. One man froze while carrying firewood, certain that the overseer's shadow had moved ahead of him, settling on the edge of the path before he himself arrived. He shook his head, blaming cold or lack of sleep, but the weight of unease remained. Each day, the shadow seemed bolder, moving independently, yet reflecting his form with a fidelity that was unnerving, as if it were watching and learning. It was not just the workers who felt the change. The overseer's own perception began to falter. In the quiet moments between tasks, when he paused to sign logs or inspect barns, he caught glimpses of himself in windows or reflective surfaces, only to realize the movement did not match his own. A hand would lift before his did, a step forward taken in hesitation, and sometimes the reflection would hold him in its gaze longer than reality allowed. He frowned at the glass and mirrors, accusing them of being imperfect or damaged, but the sensation of being followed, of being mirrored by something not alive yet not absent, would not fade. Even as he moved outdoors, the shadows followed. In the long stretches of frost-bitten field, sunlight slanting across fences and frozen ground through elongated shapes that should have been ordinary. Instead, the overseer noticed angles wrong, contours inconsistent, a subtle misalignment that set nerves on edge. He tried to dismiss it, muttering that imagination had no place in labor, but the shadows did not relent. At times, he would turn quickly, expecting to see someone hiding, only to find the fields empty and silent, save for the wind whispering across the bare soil. The workers, already wary from nights spent hearing footsteps or whispers, watched from a distance as their master began to exhibit small, uncharacteristic hesitations. The shadows moved in ways that suggested knowledge, presence, and intent. Every time the overseer glanced over his shoulder, the workers could see him stiffen, as though sensing something watching that was neither human nor entirely of the world they knew. And the plantation seemed to hold its breath with them. The storm arrived suddenly, as if it had been waiting for the plantation to be left unguarded, a dark presence gathering beyond the tree line before it touched the fields. Clouds rolled low and fast, suffocating the weak light of day and casting everything in an unnatural gray. The wind rose first, whispering through the bare branches, then howling, rattling shutters and shaking the fragile wooden fences. Snow began to fall, fine and icy, turning quickly to thick flakes that whipped across the yard, cutting through cloaks and coats and forcing workers to huddle near the houses. What should have been a simple winter squall carried a sense of inevitability, as if it were sent not to inconvenience, but to trap and observe. The overseer's first reaction was anger, loud and sharp, cursing the weather and blaming the workers for failing to secure barns and doors. He paced across the yard, boots sinking into the snow, eyes narrowed, trying to impose order on chaos that would not obey. The wind tore at his voice, carrying it into the fields in fragments, and he found himself shouting to nobody, to nothing, yet expecting compliance. The animals were already restless, pawing at frozen ground, whining or braying in fear. Horses refused to enter barns. Cows clustered near fences, and even the dogs, normally loyal and bold, stayed close to the quarters, tails tucked, shivering against the cold. The snow fell faster, and visibility dropped. Paths and familiar landmarks disappeared under its growing weight. Workers found themselves pressed against one another, moving slowly to maintain footing, the overseer's commands barely audible over the roar of wind and storm. The child who had once heard the dying woman's whisper felt the snow's bite differently, sharper and more deliberate, almost like a warning. Every gust seemed to reach past the flesh and into the bones, whispering that no one could leave, that the storm had claimed the plantation for itself. By nightfall, the storm had trapped everyone within sight of the main house. Travel beyond was impossible. Doors rattled against their frames, the roof groaned under the weight of snow, and windows became mirrors of flickering lamplight, reflecting shadows that seemed too numerous and too deliberate. The overseer, who had always relied on control, found it slipping through his hands, powerless against something that obeyed no command and respected no hierarchy. Anxiety began to gnaw at him as the wind's howl rose higher, drowning the voices of workers and animals alike. Inside the house, the air grew tense and heavy, carrying a chill that refused to be banished by the hearth. Candles flickered violently, shadows dancing and stretching along walls as if alive. The storm pressed against the plantation from all sides, isolating the overseer and the workers, binding them together with cold and fear. Each snow-laden gust seemed to carry intent, the land itself conspiring to remind them that the weather was no ordinary hindrance, but a force that could not be bargained with or ignored, and that the plantation, its people, and the overseer himself were now entirely at its mercy. By the following days, the overseer began to feel the first tangible consequences of the whispers and warnings that had plagued the plantation. It started subtly, with a persistent cough that seemed more than ordinary illness. At first, he dismissed it as the bitter winter air or a poor night's sleep, yet the sensation deepened unnervingly. Each cough brought with it a strange grit, like fine particles of soil lodged deep in his throat, clinging as though the earth itself had decided to reclaim him. No matter how he tried to clear it, he could feel the weight of the soil grinding against him, sticking to his tongue, teeth, and lungs. He sought relief in medicine, concoctions handed down from the plantation's doctor, yet nothing alleviated the strange, constant presence within him. Even water failed to wash the taste away, leaving him tasting earth with every swallow. The smell of it clung to his breath, mingling with sweat and smoke from the hearth, and soon the smell followed him into rooms where he thought he could hide it. His hands, already uneasy with the odor of decay from earlier days, began to tremble as he realized the soil had become part of him, not just lingering around him, but inside him, consuming the space between control and helplessness. Sleep offered no reprieve. When he drifted into dreams, he found himself buried alive beneath cold, packed earth, struggling to move, his body trapped in a suffocating, unyielding weight. The visions were vivid and persistent, replaying the moments when the dying woman had lain on the ground, her whispered words now echoing with clarity and accusation. Upon waking, he would find traces of fine dirt clinging to his skin, to the inside of his sleeves, as if the earth had followed him from the grave. Each cough brought more grit, deeper and heavier, embedding itself with a stubbornness that mocked his attempts to cleanse. He began avoiding mirrors, fearful of seeing the toll the soil was taking on him. His skin grew paler, eyes hollowed, hands cracked and dirty even after scrubbing. The plantation workers noticed his decline, some whispering to one another about the curse, while others kept their distance, afraid that proximity would carry contamination or misfortune. The overseer, once confident and imperious, now moved through the plantation with a hesitation born of both physical discomfort and creeping dread. Even routine tasks became arduous. Handling animals, signing documents, inspecting barns. All were interrupted by coughing fits that rattled him to the core, sometimes leaving him spitting soil into the snow outside. The taste, smell, and weight of it were constant reminders that the dying woman's final moments had not been contained, that something had been awakened in the earth, patient and relentless, intent on reclaiming what he had so carelessly disrespected, and that he could no longer escape the claim it had laid on him. The dying woman's name had been spoken for the first time since her burial, carried quietly through the quarters by trembling lips that barely dared to form it. It began as a whisper among the younger workers, a cautious repetition of what they had overheard in fleeting moments, spoken to each other in low tones when they thought no one was listening. The name itself held weight, sharp and deliberate, like a blade that had been hidden too long. Even those who had avoided the fields that day felt it echo in their minds, as though the syllables themselves pressed against the skull, impossible to ignore. Word spread slowly at first, as fear does when it travels carefully through eyes and gestures rather than speech. The plantation seemed to contract around it, hallways narrower, rooms colder, shadows stretching further than the firelight should allow. Workers paused in mid-task, tools slipping from hands, hearts beating unevenly. The elders who had survived decades under similar conditions recognized the danger in naming, but even they could not stop the trembling voices that carried it forward. Each utterance felt like a small thread pulling the plantation towards something inevitable, as if the name alone had power enough to bend reality. The overseer noticed it too, though not immediately. At first, He heard fragments of it in passing, hushed murmurs that he dismissed as gossip. Yet over the following hours, the sound seemed to grow louder, more persistent, echoing in corners, behind doors, and even through the walls. His reaction was a mixture of disbelief and irritation, anger simmering beneath a veneer of control. He demanded the name not be spoken, yet in speaking the command, he gave it more weight, drawing attention to the very thing he feared. Each time it was repeated, his unease deepened, a gnawing that no amount of firelight or busywork could dispel. The child who had heard the whisper the night the woman died understood more than anyone else. The name was not just a word. It was a signal, a reminder of the debt left unpaid and the injustice witnessed. He watched as the overseer's movements became sharper, more deliberate, almost defensive. The animals, too, seemed to respond, restless in barns and fields, hooves and paws pressing against the earth as though aware of the invisible weight gathering in the name's utterance. By evening, the name had spread across the plantation, carried in whispers, in glances, in the tremor of hands reaching for tools. Fear layered itself atop routine, and even those who had not directly witnessed the woman's suffering felt the pressure of it. The overseer, who had once believed himself untouchable, began to falter under its intangible weight. The very act of naming had brought the woman's presence into the living world once more, and with each repetition, it pressed closer, insistent, reminding everyone that the cruelty done could not be ignored, and that something long silent was now awakening with deliberate intent. The child finally spoke, though his voice was barely more than a tremor, carrying the weight of what he had heard the dying woman whisper in the cold air. He had repeated it to himself countless times since that night, turning the words over like stones in his mind, feeling the sharp edges of meaning without fully understanding them. "You will kneel before the ground," he said, the syllables trembling but clear enough for those nearest to hear. The air seemed to tighten around the phrase, pressing against the ears and lungs of everyone within range. The workers froze, tools suspended midair, and even the wind seemed to hush in anticipation. The overseer, who had long believed that fear could only be wielded by the living, heard the words and laughed at first, a harsh, sharp sound meant to dismiss their power. He assumed a child's imagination, the echo of tales meant to keep the young in line. Yet there was something in the tone and certainty of the utterance that gnawed at him. The syllables clung to the air, repeating themselves in the mind like an unwelcome refrain. His hands, already bearing the residue of earth and decay, clenched involuntarily. A prickling sensation crawled along his skin, as if the ground itself had heard and was answering. The workers dared not speak. They had witnessed enough over the years to know that even the faintest acknowledgement of what the whisper promised could invite catastrophe. Yet the phrase lingered in the air, not just a warning but a demand, insistent and unyielding. Each repetition by the child carried weight, as though the act of speaking the words aloud gave them strength, and with each repetition, the overseer felt a growing unease he could neither rationalize nor ignore. Outside, the frost seemed heavier, pressing down on the soil with an unnatural weight. Animals pressed close to the earth, hooves and paws shivering, as if recognizing the authority in the words. Even the wind bent differently around the fields, brushing low and deliberate, threading through fences and barns like an invisible hand steering the attention of all who were present. The overseer attempted to move, to dismiss the moment with motion and authority, but each step seemed to falter under an invisible pressure. His boots sank slightly more than usual into the frozen ground, and he felt the earth shifting beneath him, unyielding yet insistent. The words, simple yet heavy, continued to echo in his mind, a gnawing reminder that no power could lift him above the consequences of his own cruelty. Every instinct he had honed over years of domination failed him. Even the air inside the house, once a place of control and order, now felt laden with the weight of inevitability. He realized, perhaps too late, that the dying woman's final act had been deliberate, that her words had been a binding force, and that they were no longer just whispers. They were a summons, a reckoning, and something waiting to claim the space he had taken for granted. Christmas Eve arrived under a sky that seemed impossibly dark, heavy with snow that fell in thick, suffocating sheets. The plantation, usually alive with preparations for the holiday, was silent except for the wind's relentless howl and the occasional creak of frozen wood. The overseer, shaken by days of unexplainable events, the sinking earth, the restless animals, the whispers of the dead, decided he could no longer remain. The fear that had been growing inside him all week coiled tight around his chest, and he resolved to flee before the night fully claimed him. He dressed quickly, pulling his coat tight against the cold, boots crunching in the crusted snow as he moved toward the path leading away from the house. As he stepped onto the road, the air seemed thicker than it should have been, pressing against his chest, pushing back with a subtle insistence. The path he had taken countless times before felt unfamiliar, uneven, as if the earth itself had shifted to impede him. The trees along the roadside bent under the weight of snow, their branches twisted in impossible angles, forming arches and shadows that seemed to lean toward him, guiding him back instead of forward. Every step he took, the snow underfoot yielded in ways that made his progress slow and exhausting, leaving him frustrated and increasingly aware that he was not moving as quickly as he intended. The wind carried faint whispers, low and insistent, echoing in his ears. He thought they were his imagination, yet each syllable was familiar, the same rhythm, the same cadence as the dying woman's voice, the words that had been repeated by the child days before. "You will kneel before the ground." They wrapped around him like icy fingers, tugging him from behind, ahead, and to the sides, always keeping him off balance. Panic began to seep into his mind, but instinctively, he forced his legs forward, determined to reach the edge of the plantation where freedom, he imagined, awaited. The snow-obscured landmarks he had relied on for years, transforming familiar roads into an unrecognizable maze. Shadows stretched longer than they should, bending unnaturally, as if the night itself was alive, watching, steering him. Every time he thought he had finally broken free, he realized he was circling back, the same frozen fence posts, the same hollowed-out tree trunks appearing again and again. The sense of being trapped, pursued, and guided all at once grew overwhelming. By the time he recognized the truth, exhaustion and fear had weakened his resolve. The road no longer led outward but inward, back toward the house he had attempted to leave behind. His boots sank deeper into the snow, heart racing, breath ragged, and the inevitability of his situation pressed down with the weight of the storm and the words that refused to release him. A force as patient as the earth itself and as deliberate as the whisper that had followed him for days, the footprints appeared suddenly, appearing in the snow behind him with a regularity that was impossible to ignore. They were bare, bleeding faintly into the white, as though the earth itself had taken a hand in marking his path. The overseer stopped abruptly, eyes wide and heart pounding, scanning the snow behind him for any sign of a pursuer, a worker, or even an animal. Nothing moved, yet the prints continued to extend, each step perfectly aligned with his own, yet never showing the presence of flesh or boots. The snow, freshly fallen and undisturbed elsewhere, betrayed a pattern too deliberate to be accidental. Panic set in as he tried to rationalize it. Perhaps someone had followed him, someone clever enough to remain unseen while leaving a trace meant to terrify. But no, the tracks were bare, untouched by gloves, boots, or clothing. They bled as if drawn directly from the earth, and the overseer felt the cold reach deeper into his chest, more than the storm or frost could account for. He forced himself to move faster, crunching through the snow with a desperate energy, only to glance back and see the prints matching him step for step, following inexorably as though they were the extension of some force tied to his very movement. Each footfall behind him seemed to echo louder than his own, the sound muted by snow yet present, insistent, reminding him that he could not escape what had been set in motion. His breath came in ragged gasps, mingling with the cold air, freezing invisible clouds that drifted around him like small warnings. The words whispered days ago, repeated by the child, rang in his ears. "You will kneel before the ground." The syllables no longer belonged solely to memory. They seemed embedded in the rhythm of the footprints, guiding, urging, and accusing simultaneously. He stumbled over a hidden root, catching himself just in time, and the footprints continued without hesitation, perfectly aligned with his faltering steps. His mind screamed to run, to turn and confront whoever, or whatever, was behind him, yet reason offered no comfort. Every instinct told him the prints were not human, that they were an extension of the earth itself, a deliberate manifestation of the woman's final curse. Trees bent unnaturally over the path, their shadows elongating, twisting to obscure the way forward while framing the trail behind him, emphasizing the inevitability of pursuit. By the time he reached the edge of the field, exhaustion and fear had slowed his legs to a near crawl. The footprints continued in the snow behind him, relentless, bleeding faintly into the white, following his every movement. He knew with a growing certainty that they would not stop, that the ground itself had taken up the task of reminding him, that every attempt at escape had been anticipated, and that the woman's whispered words had found their physical echo in the very path he had chosen to flee along, a path that no longer led to freedom, but toward the reckoning waiting for him. The plantation grew impossibly silent as the night deepened, the usual creaks, whispers, and distant calls of animals fading into an unnatural stillness that pressed on everyone and everything. Even the wind seemed to hesitate, curling around the corners of the buildings and the edges of the frozen fields without scattering snow or rattling shutters. The house itself felt different, as if it were holding its breath, aware of the weight pressing against its walls and the inevitability waiting beyond the doors. Lamps flickered with an irregular rhythm, throwing long, twisting shadows that pooled in corners, creating shapes that moved just beyond the edge of vision. The silence was thick enough to taste, clinging to the tongue, pressing on the chest. Inside, the overseer paced restlessly, boots echoing off the floorboards, yet each step seemed to absorb into the stillness rather than break it. He felt eyes on him, though no one stood near. Windows reflected flickers of candlelight, and he swore he glimpsed shapes there that mimicked his posture, lingering longer than any person could. Every sound he made, his voice, the clatter of a chair, the scrape of a boot, was amplified in the silence, leaving him raw and exposed, as if the house itself were listening and waiting to respond. The workers remained quiet, huddled in corners and under dim lanterns, faces pale and eyes wide, too afraid to speak, yet aware that the atmosphere had shifted, as though the plantation had become a single organism, holding itself in anticipation. The animals were no less affected. Horses huddled together in the fields, ears flicking toward unseen movements, nostrils flaring against the frost-laden air. Dogs whined softly, tails tucked, pacing in small circles, and even the barn cats, normally indifferent, crept low along fences and beams, alert to something beyond their understanding. Every living creature seemed aware that the plantation itself had grown watchful, that the night was no longer ordinary, and that the balance between life and the unseen had shifted dramatically. The snow outside intensified the stillness, falling in heavy silence that muffled any ordinary sound, yet made the movements of shadows inside the house feel exaggerated, almost deliberate. The overseer's breath clouded in the cold, forming shapes that seemed to twist toward the corners of the rooms, vanishing before he could focus on them. Every instinct he had honed over years of control failed him now, leaving him raw, uncertain, and increasingly aware that the plantation was no longer his domain in the way he had believed. As the hours passed, the silence deepened further, pressing on the minds of all who remained awake, bending their thoughts toward unease and dread. The house, the fields, the trees, the very ground seemed to converge in anticipation, holding itself as though waiting for a moment that had been long foretold. Every creak, every shadow, every frozen breath became amplified in that quiet, and the overseer, usually unshakable, felt the full weight of awareness pressing upon him, realizing that the plantation itself knew more than he ever could, and that whatever was coming would not be delayed before sunrise. The overseer was found, not where anyone expected, but collapsed in the mud near the edge of the frozen field, knees pressed into the icy soil as though he had finally submitted to the weight that had pursued him for days. His coat was dusted with snow, soaked through in places where he had stumbled and fallen, and his hands were clawed into the earth, fingers sunk deep into the cold, unforgiving ground. His face was pale and rigid, frozen in a grimace that suggested both exhaustion and a dawning recognition of the inevitable, a terror that had finally caught up with him. The footprints that had followed him through the storm seemed to fade into nothing just beyond his knees, as if the force behind them had paused, satisfied that its work had been completed. The workers who found him recoiled instinctively, huddling together as they took in the scene. The overseer, once a figure of absolute authority, lay vulnerable and diminished, a man whose cruelty and certainty had been stripped away by forces he could neither see nor control. Silence had fallen over the plantation, thicker than the snow that still coated the fields, and even the animals seemed aware of the shift, standing quietly in small clusters, ears pricked, watching. The air itself felt heavier, charged with the residue of the day's unnatural events. The whispers, the sinking earth, the persistent odor of soil clinging to the man, and carried a warning that all who remained could feel pressing down into their bones. No one touched him at first. The sight of a man, once untouchable, brought low and kneeling in the mud, held an unspoken lesson that reverberated through the workers' minds. Even the wind, which had howled through the storm, seemed to pause in respect or fear, brushing softly against the snow-draped trees and frozen fences. It was as though the earth itself had claimed the overseer in the final act of judgment, leaving him to kneel in submission, helpless against the consequences of his own cruelty. The child who had once heard the dying woman's whisper did not speak, but he understood the meaning of the scene without explanation. The words spoken that night, repeated again and again, had been realized. The overseer was kneeling before the ground, powerless, bound by a force older and more patient than any human authority. The others began to move cautiously, covering their eyes briefly, then slowly retreating to the safety of the house. Their whispers carried no words of comfort, only awe and fear, as they pieced together the events that had led to this moment, the culmination of months of neglect, cruelty, and supernatural insistence. Even as dawn's first light crept across the plantation, it could not pierce the weight of what had occurred. The overseer remained kneeling, immobile, a living monument to the inevitability that follows cruelty unchecked, a warning etched in flesh and mud, while the plantation itself seemed to settle into a tense quiet, acknowledging that something fundamental had changed, that the balance had been restored in a way that no one could alter, and that the morning's light was powerless against the shadow of what had been wrought. Christmas morning arrived under a sky heavy with gray clouds, the snow settling in thick, silent layers across the plantation as if the world itself were holding its breath. The usual sounds of celebration, the clatter of dishes, the murmur of greetings, the laughter of children, were absent, replaced by an oppressive stillness that weighed on every structure, every tree, every frozen patch of ground. The house, normally a center of warmth and human assertion, stood cold and dark, shutters rattling faintly in the wind, as though even the building itself had recognized that the overseer's absence had stripped the day of its customary authority. Those who remained on the plantation moved quietly, careful not to disturb the fragile tension that seemed to linger in the air, each step muffled by fresh snow, each breath shallow and measured. The overseer, whose presence had once defined the day, was nowhere to be seen, and his absence cast a long shadow over the land that had once been ruled by his cruelty. Workers whispered among themselves, voices low, carrying a mixture of fear, relief, and uncertainty. The child who had heard the dying woman's whisper days before understood more than anyone else, sensing that the events leading up to this morning were not simply accidents or chance. Something older had settled over the plantation, an invisible hand correcting the imbalance left by years of injustice, cruelty, and neglect. Even the animals, usually restless on Christmas morning, remained clustered and still, their eyes wide, ears flicking nervously as if aware of the day's altered nature. No festive preparations took place. The hearths burned low, and any food that might have been intended for celebration remained untouched, the smell of smoke and charred wood hanging faintly in the rooms. Outside, the snow muffled footsteps and voices alike, transforming the familiar fields into a landscape of isolation and waiting. Shadows stretched unnaturally long along the house and barns, the frozen ground beneath them seeming to hold more than mere frost, an echo of all that had come before, all the whispers, footsteps, and curses that had accumulated in the air and soil over days of relentless tension. The absence of the overseer, the man who had once imposed fear with certainty, transformed the mourning into something almost sacred in its dread. No one dared to move too quickly, to speak too loudly, or to challenge the silence that had settled over the plantation. It was a day that marked not celebration but awareness, a recognition that actions left unresolved can ripple outward, that cruelty carries consequences, and that even the earth itself can exact justice in ways human hands cannot undo. By the time the sun threatened to pierce the gray, the plantation remained still, uncelebrated, and uneasy. Christmas morning, meant to signify joy and renewal, instead became a marker of absence, a reminder of inevitability, and a warning carried in the frozen fields and silent barns that some deeds, once done, cannot be undone, and that no amount of holiday light or human effort could restore the certainty or power that had once ruled the land.